Hello and welcome to this fortnight's Detective Diaries, where I take you through some of the most interesting or exciting or unusual finds I've uncovered during my house history research. This week I've got so many interesting things. So we've got a fantastic illustration of Brisbane from 1894 that I uncovered. I'm going to go into the history of the incredible Lynne Grove House at Corinda and tell you the story of one of the remarkable women that lived there. Next up, I'm going to get all X-Files and talk about aliens. No, it's actually not that kind of alien, it's immigrants, and how during the First and Second World War, some of the immigrants from countries that were not allies were actually interred in basically what were prisoner of war camps in Australia. I'll be talking about one immigrant in particular and some of the records that show that he was actually under surveillance the entire time after he arrived in Australia. Then I'll be delving into the minutes of Noosa Shire Council meetings. Now that might sound very boring, and at times it is, but it also is a treasure trove of information that told me so much about Tewantin in particular, which is where I was researching a place. Finally, speaking of Tewantin, in the process of researching a building there, I uncovered the most fabulous old photos of the area. So these are back mainly from the 30s, when there was basically not much in town at all. It was a spot for camping and fishing, and they're fantastic. Any of you that know Tewantin will be amazed by these great old photos. So I hope you enjoy watching. First up, I wanted to show you this incredible artwork image that I stumbled across in the State Library of Queensland collection. Now, I showed this on my Facebook and Instagram, so some of you may have seen it, but I just thought it was worthy of sharing again here because it's just, firstly, it's absolutely beautiful. The artwork is amazing and the illustrations are just gorgeous, but it's also wonderful from a historical perspective because it captures what some of our main thoroughfares in the CBD, Queen Street, Adelaide Street and Edward Street, looked like in 1894. In addition to showing a whole heap of buildings and businesses that were operating at that time, but even I think the best thing about this is that it actually shows the interior of some of these buildings and the interior operations of some of these businesses, which you rarely ever get a glimpse at from that period. So I thought I would share it here. One landmark that you can see in one of these drawings is the Mooney Fountain at the junction of Queen and Eagle Streets, which is really cool, and that's got its own story in itself. The other great thing is there was Turkish baths in Brisbane in 1894. Who knew? And there's actually someone saw me post about this, and they actually got in touch to say that there was a newspaper account and the journalist was actually visiting the baths and had done an article explaining how they worked and that they weren't scary or anything nefarious, and you could go there and enjoy some relaxing time, having a shower, having a bath, having a massage and having some pampering basically. So that is really cool in itself, and I had absolutely no idea that these Turkish baths were a thing. But that's only one of the many buildings shown on here, and if I have time I would love to go through and actually identify each of the buildings that are shown and work out a little bit about the history of each, maybe who designed them, that type of thing. But I think the overall poster or artwork was a marketing ploy by Finney Isles & Co. You can see their name down the bottom there. And they are probably worthy of their own episode in themselves. They were an early department store in Brisbane, very well known. So sort of like your David Jones of the past, and some of you may remember McWhirter's or what's the one my mum used to work for? McDonnell and East, those types of things. They were massive department stores and they were the place to go to do your shopping. So very interesting relic from the past, this one. And as I said, just the artwork itself is just so beautiful. I love uncovering things like this. And this one in particular because it does give you an insight into the Brisbane CBD in 1894. Now, okay, shameless plug. If you love this poster and you want it printed to go on your wall, or you want it printed on some gift cards or printed on merchandise like a t-shirt or I don't know, what else have we got? We've got mugs, that type of thing. I'll put a link in the description to my shop where I sell a whole range of different products, and you can get this image or a range of other historical maps and images of Brisbane printed on cool stuff, basically. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the history. Lynne Grove House. Now, this amazing residence is at Corinda, and I was actually hired a number of years ago to do a brief history of the home, but it's come back into the forefront of my mind because it's currently on sale, and I will put a link to the real estate site in the description. But I have also been hired by the owners again to do a little bit more research into the house, and particularly to focus on one of the residents of this house. So I'll get to that in a minute. The house was built by Robert Francis Hassell in about 1883. And if you are familiar with your Corinda and Sherwood history, then that name might ring a bell. And there's a Hassell Street at Corinda, which is named in the memory of that family. His father was Reverend James Samuel Hassell, and he was the first minister in the Sherwood area. He was connected with St. Matthew's at Sherwood, and although the original church that he would have preached at is no longer there, it was burnt down, there is still a St. Matthew's church, and there's still a St. Matthew's cemetery near the location of the original church. Now, he was kind of a big deal, and his son also was quite wealthy and quite prominent in the local community. So he built this beautiful grand house to himself in 1883, and I think it was his brother or his father that actually lived on the block next door, and where Corinda State High School is now on Pratton Street. But I digress. So he was the one that christened the house Lynne Grove. I wasn't able to uncover where that name came from, whether it had a family connection from back in England or some other connection, and it's changed spelling over the years. So it gave its name to the street that leads straight to the property, and it's called Lynne Grove, L-Y-N-N-E, second word Grove, G-R-O-V-E, but it was also spelled L-I-N-G-R-O-V-E, one word at times, and a variety of different spellings as well. The Hassell family lived there for a number of years, and there's plenty of history around about the Hassell family if you want to find out more about them. The Hassell family sold the property to Thomas Ramsay Hall, and he lived there with his wife for a number of years, but it's actually the next owner that myself and the current owner of the property are most intrigued by. In 1914, Laura Duncan purchased Lynne Grove House. Now, I cannot express to you how ahead of her time and how remarkable this woman was for the era, well, even for now, really. So she was born in 1875 in Sydney, and as far as I can tell, was raised in quite a genteel family. Her sister Millicent actually married a man who lived on and ran a cattle property out at Birdsville. Birdsville is a small town, and it's about as far west as you can go in Queensland before you trip over into the Simpson Desert and eventually the Northern Territory. It's a great little town. If you ever get a chance to visit there, it's amazing, and you have to have a beer at the pub. It's mandatory. But she moved out there to live with her husband, and I can only imagine what a shock to the system that must have been. I mean, Birdsville's still quite a small, very remote town these days, although it gets plenty of visitors. But for someone from Sydney who's used to the city life to go and live on a rural property like this in the early 1900s must have been quite a shock. But eventually Laura joined her sister and brother-in-law on this property, and it was there that she met her future husband, William Duncan. They eventually got married and they bought their own property. They called their property, now I have no idea how to pronounce this, I apologise if you know how to pronounce it and I've got it wrong, Murraberry? I don't know, something like that. I'll put the spelling up here and you can check. Again, this is quite a remote area even now, let alone back in 1906 when they bought this property. Laura and William established a cattle property on this land as well. But tragically, William died only the following year. But incredibly, instead of running back to her family in Sydney or wherever they were at that stage, or moving back in with her sister and brother-in-law, Laura stayed on at the property and continued to run it, whilst also raising 3 children. So that's pretty remarkable for the period in itself. But not only that, she actually was very clever, and she developed a really good quality short horn herd of cattle as well, and it became quite well known as a breed. She also pioneered a number of different innovations in the beef industry as well, which is quite fascinating. Now, I'm really looking forward to finding out more about her because I've only really just scratched the surface so far, but I've just found out that there are a number of oral histories that have been recorded and are available online through the State Library of Queensland, and they actually discuss her and people's recollections of her and her daughter. So her daughter, when she was old enough, actually joined her mum in running the cattle property as well. She was also Laura. So incredible mother-daughter duo, and like I said, I look forward to learning more about them. There's also a book on Laura at the State Library, so I'm looking forward to going in and having a good read about that as well, because I just think that she has such a fascinating tale to tell. But anyway, getting back to the house, which began all of this, she bought it in 1914, as I said, and after the First World War broke out, she actually donated the house for use as a children's home. So not to be confused with an orphanage, this was a children's home. And the difference was that this house was provided by Laura for the care of children whose parents couldn't look after them. So if you imagine, a lot of fathers were away at war, and perhaps the women, the mothers, had to go out and work and they had no one to care for their children. So they may have left their children at this house. Laura was the patron of the establishment, but there was a committee that managed it, and they employed a number of nurses and other staff to care for the children. And there are some fantastic photographs of the house inside and out from during this use in about, I think it was about 1918. And there's also a photo of one of the verandas which shows all the cots set up for the young children that they were looking after. It was only ever meant to be for 12 months that she loaned the use of this house, but it ended up being for 4 years. So basically the entirety, almost the entirety of the war. So this was just incredible in itself, and I think that probably she was a little bit more sympathetic to this cause. She's actually lost a son quite young, so I couldn't help but wonder if that was sort of where this idea of wanting to care for other young children that were a bit disadvantaged or not able to be cared for by their parents came from. So that's just a summary of this amazing woman, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what else I can uncover about her, because I just think she has the most amazing story to tell. And that's why I love researching houses so much, because it brings stories like this to light that otherwise this woman would have just faded into the past and no one would have known about her except her immediate family. So I love that I can share these stories with you for a start, but also document them and capture them for the future. Okay, so I promised you some X-Files alien action, but as I said, it is not the little green men type, it is the immigrant type. In episode 18, I covered the shootings and bombings that occurred at Wickham House and Bellow Chambers on Wickham Terrace at Spring Hill. Now, as part of researching the guy that was responsible for this tragedy, I uncovered a number of files on him in the National Archives of Australia. He first enters the scene when he jumped ship in 1939. He was from Germany, and from the very time he set foot in Australia, he was being monitored by the government and tracked by the government. And they were very interested in his political affiliations. They were very worried that Nazi spies were going to enter Australia to collect information. And so there is this series of documents that tracks his movement, who he was meeting with, who his friends were, who his contacts were, what his political leanings were, what his story was from back in Germany, and all this amazing information. And so for me, this is fantastic as a historian. There's just so much information there. But for him, probably not so great. But what is also interesting, and this is an area that I don't know a whole lot about, I knew it happened, but during the Second World War, enemies of the Allies, so Germans, Japanese, Italians, were actually locked up in Australia in what were effectively prisoner of war camps. They were called internment camps, but you were basically locked up, and in some cases you undertook labour and various things. But these weren't recent immigrants just like Carl Cass. These were people who had lived in Australia for, you know, maybe almost all their life, 20, 30 years. They were established in the community. They had houses. You know, a lot of them probably identified as being Australian, but because of their ethnicity, they were considered risks to security or for whatever reasons, and they were herded up, rounded up, and put into these camps. It's such a fascinating part of our history, and I can't imagine what it must have been like for these people who were suddenly considered alien. Karl Kast was one of these. Siegfried Karl Kast is his actual name. He was one of these Germans who were placed into internment camps, and he obviously was not happy about this because he wrote a number of letters complaining and seeking release. He also escaped from various camps 4 times. So included in his records are these amazing basically like newspaper media releases where it's got his photo, in one case it's got fingerprints and a description of him, where he escaped from, all those kinds of details, and they were trying to track him down and recapture him. He did get recaptured every time. And it's quite an insight not only into Karl's history, but the operation of these camps. And it's a fascinating insight into his background, and there's sort of no red flags really that would suggest, there's no violent behaviour documented or anything else that would suggest that he was at risk of committing the crimes that he did on Wickham Terrace. And in fact, he was actually naturalised and became a citizen of Australia, which required a bit of a background check. So obviously time enough had passed after the Second World War for him to pass those criteria, whatever they were. So I just found it absolutely fascinating. And again, this is what I love about my research. I can be researching a house or a building, but it leads me to researching this person, and then I uncover all this intelligence agency documentation and things like that, and then I uncover all this information about these alien internment camps and how things operated during the Second World War. It's just, yeah, I love my job. I was hired to research a place at Tewantin recently. So for those of you who don't know, it's sort of just inland from Noosa on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And it's a gorgeous little spot. I've got really lovely memories of going up there as a child because my husband calls her my fairy godmother. She was basically like a grandma to me, but she wasn't related to us. She was a friend of my mum's who was a little bit older. And we used to go and stay with her up there. And we also, as kids, used to camp at Munna Point. And so I've got lovely memories of holidaying up there. And I was reading through the Noosa Shire Council minutes. So Tewantin and Noosa and a wide area fell within a council area that was Noosa Shire. It's now just Noosa Council. And the early minutes of this council are all digitised and text searchable and available online on Heritage Noosa. Now, and if you haven't had a look at this Heritage Noosa site and you're interested in that area, it's a massive repository of historical information. There's photographs, there's oral histories, there's reminiscences, there's histories, local histories on there, and then there's these copies of the Noosa Shire Council minutes. Now, as you can probably imagine, council meeting minutes aren't always that riveting. And I have been trolling through a whole heap of boring things, and I have to laugh because I'm sure if you ask current council members these days, not much has changed. There's heaps of people whinging about the condition of the roads, or whinging about their neighbours, or complaining that there's a council tree that needs trimming or something like that. But although it's these trivial things and a lot of it's quite tedious, it's such a great insight into how these councils were run, but also into the local area. And there's key figures and key residents that reoccur all the time, and you actually develop a bit of a feel for some of the personalities in the area as well. So I've had a great time reading all these. I was specifically searching for records that mentioned the building I was researching. So in addition to all the everyday trivial things, the council also received applications to undertake building work and that type of thing. So I can trawl through, and if it says, you know, a building for such and such on such and such street was approved at this meeting, then I can estimate that it was probably built not that long afterwards. So they're really good sources of information from that respect. One of the things that really struck me was, like I said, my memories of this area are from holidaying there, and it's obviously still quite a popular holiday spot around that entire district. And it surprised me from how early on it was a favourite holiday spot for people. These records, I think the earliest ones I was looking back to were 1910s, and even back then it was basically somewhere that people holidayed, and a lot of the mentions of Tewantin in the council minutes are to do with facilities for campers, facilities for holiday makers, tennis courts, swimming pools, those types of things. And also there was a couple of really big hotels there, and they're often expanding or looking to run a car service to pick people up from the railway, those types of things. So you really get a feel for this early township and how much of a holiday destination it was even in its early days, and it was just absolutely fascinating. Continuing on from the Tewantin research, part of what I was looking for was some old photos of the place that I'm researching. So, oh my gosh, I had so much fun. I probably spent way too much time on it, but so much fun trawling through all the old photos, particularly of Tewantin, but also of the Noosa area. Some of my favourites were the old photos of what's the Royal Mail Hotel at Tewantin, and it was originally a gorgeous timber building that burnt down, and then it was replaced with, I'm pretty sure it's the building that's still there now, but it was built in the 1930s from memory, and it's much altered now. So it was really cool to see that transition of the hotel and how popular it's remained throughout its time as well. When I think back to the council minutes, like I mentioned, they were constantly improving things and offering new services that needed approval from council. So that was really interesting. And then it was just seeing basically how undeveloped the area was. So there's all these fantastic photos and a couple of great panoramas of the Noosa River, which is what Tewantin sits on. They show just how undeveloped the area still was, even into the 70s and 80s really. And they show lots of recreational facilities for the holidaymakers. Like there was swimming bars sectioned off from part of the river, there was tennis courts, there was boat ramps, that type of thing. So fantastic photos, absolutely loved it. And I also found a series of really cool old maps, and one of them dated back all the way to when the area that became Tewantin was first flagged by a surveyor as being a suitable spot for a township, and that was so cool. And the only development shown on the map is a selection that had been leased from the government up there, and it showed that there had been a fence built, and then there's a couple of little drawings showing where the gentleman's hut was and also another building. So there was basically nothing there at this date, and then there's a sequence of other maps that show the gradual subdivision of this area. And the great thing about that early map was there was even this fantastic artistic drawing of what the river looked like at that date. So I think that the surveyor must have been a little bit of a frustrated artist as well, because he's included that, and it's gorgeous. It just shows how unspoilt it was at that time. The other cool photos I came across were these couple of photos of vehicles up at the Rainbow Sands and in Skip Point, which is still one of the most popular four-wheel driving spots in that region, and it's absolutely gorgeous up there. I've been up there a number of times and camped up there before as well. It's just beautiful. But these were really early cars, and I had to laugh because someone's taken photos of the coloured sand, but there was no colour photography, so it's a black and white photo. So it kind of, doesn't really showcase it the best, but it's interesting nonetheless, and I just love the old cars that are up there as well. Very cool. But very interesting that that beach as a four-wheel drive destination dates from quite early on. If you're interested in looking at more photos, or you want to find these ones, then pop over to Heritage Noosa. I'll put a link in the description as well, and it's a total rabbit hole. You'll be on there for hours. If you've got any family that come from that area too, you're likely to find some information on them. And they're also likely to show up in the Noosa Council minutes if they ever interacted with council. So it can be quite fascinating there and quite a good source of information. Well, that's episode 19 done and dusted. I hope you enjoyed watching this one and have found some of the topics as interesting as I did. You know the drill. Hit that like button if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. See you next time.